Thank you, everybody, for coming. Welcome to the Harvard Faculty Club. Would just like to issue very briefly, I'd like to thank our speakers, Professor Danielle Allen, Curtis Yarvin. I'd like to thank the folks from the Harvard Faculty Club that enabled this to happen. All I've basically got to say is remain respectful. Disruptive behavior, by and large, won't be tolerated. Anyhow, for a brief introduction, Professor Allen is a Harvard University professor, director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation, a political philosopher, ethicist, and public policy expert. She's also a nonprofit leader, democracy advocate, tech ethicist, and author. Her work can be found in The Atlantic, as well as The Washington Post, among other places. She led Harvard's Edmund and Lilly Center for Ethics previously, developed the roadmap to pandemic resilience during COVID, and ran for Massachusetts governor back in 2022. Her scholarship focuses on the reinvigoration of democracy, civic engagement, and institutional reform. Her most recent book, Justice by Means of Democracy, underpins this with The Radical Duke, forthcoming in 2026, if I have that right. Other works include Our Declaration and Democracy in the Time of Coronavirus. Curtis Guy Yarvin is an American blogger, political theorist, and software developer known by his pen name, Mencius Moldbug. He attended Brown University and was influenced by Silicon Valley's libertarian tech culture in the 1990s and thinkers like Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard, Thomas Carlyle, and Hans Hermann Hoppe. Yarvin developed a critical stance against democratic systems, particularly after reading Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed, back in 2001. Yarvin is a founder of the so-called neo-reactionary movement, or the Dark Enlightenment, alongside Warwick philosopher Nick Land. He wrote the blog Unqualified Reservations, advocating for replacing American democracy with an accountable monarchy or corporate-style governance, critiquing liberalism as a pervasive system he terms the cathedral. In 2002, Yarvin found the Urbit networked computing platform. Curtis Yarvin published selections from his blog, Unqualified Reservations, with Passage Press in 2023, and published his first original book, Fascicle 1, Disturbance, with Passage. So I'd like to welcome both of our speakers for a spirited debate, and I figure we ought to get into the first topic. Very briefly, in terms of the format, there will be two resolutions, each which should last for about 30 minutes, with both speakers going back and forth. After those two topics are discussed sufficiently, closing remarks will proceed. So the first matter, resolved. The long-term stability and flourishing of our society is better secured by concentrated executive authority than by democratic institutions. Perhaps for a first statement, Professor Allen.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, David. Glad to be here, and thanks to all of you for turning out. You've got dark enlightenment and bright enlightenment. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I'd like to share a little bit about where I come from in answering this question. You heard in the introduction that I am a combination of Harvard prof and democracy advocate. Folks often ask me, what exactly do you do, Danielle, with all of those different balls being juggled? And the answer is simply I work on democracy, past, present, and future, with no question mark at the end of that. That's a focus I come by super honestly. It's a matter of family inheritance, for starters. My dad's dad, my granddad on my dad's side, helped found one of the first NAACP chapters in Northern Florida in the 40s. Northern Florida at that time was just pretty much the same as Southern Georgia. So it was super dangerous. Lynchings were on the rise. He took his life into his hands to secure the right to vote. On my mom's side, my great-granddad marched with suffragettes on Boston Common in 1917. My great-grandmother ended up as president of the League of Women Voters in Michigan in the 30s. And this was because they believe that empowerment is the bedrock for human thriving and well-being. So I was fortunate to acquire that commitment in view as a young person growing up in my family. No surprise in that context, I took that for granted. I took democracy's value for granted as a young person. And of course, as I came of age, watched my own generation come up in the world, the question of democracy's value got a lot more complicated. I watched a real parting of ways, parting of experience. I have had incredible opportunities, immense privilege here in the cathedral. And as well, having had siblings as well who have thrived and so forth. At the same time, though, I have cousins, kids I used to run around the streets playing football with who aren't here any longer for all the hardest things: substance use disorder, incarceration, gun violence. And I hit a point in 2009, I lost my youngest cousin, where I started banging my head against the wall and thinking, democracy is not supposed to be abstractly valuable. Yes, we embrace these ideals of freedom and equality, but the entire point is that when we do, it delivers a society that makes it possible for every generation to do a bit better than the previous, and also for a whole cohort to come up together. And so I started working on this question of how to change the dynamic of our democracy so that it could actually deliver on the promise of democracy. And that work took me in the first instance into criminal justice reform, trying really hard to change criminal justice reform policy. And it doesn't take very long if you try to actually fix something to discover that even if you've got common sense, cross-partisan solutions, it's really hard to get things through because of governance dysfunction. And at this point, I suppose along this path, I had a philosopher dad. I know Curtis had a philosopher dad too. There's a lot of similarity in that story up to that point. And then here we part ways. Curtis sees this kind of moment in American experience, and he says, look, people, the whole history before 20th century, it's all about absolute monarchs, absolute rule, delivering for people. It's about absolute monarchs who operated in a context of belief in racial hierarchy. They delivered for people in the same way that corporations did, with the mission of maximizing their capital. Their capital is land and people. Because of wanting to invest in land and people, and because of believing in racial hierarchies, they embrace racial cleansing, and that's what you've got to do to have a society that's going to deliver for people. And so Curtis's view is that our 20th century world is founded on lies, the lies of egalitarianism and the lies that democracy can actually deliver for people. And because it's founded on those lies, he thinks it's foundering. He thinks we need regime change. He thinks we need an absolute monarch, unaccountable, no separation of powers, no checks and balances, no limits, and so forth. Could be Trump. We kind of elected him. Maybe that's already happening. That's what Curtis says in his book. Could be Musk. He doesn't say that in his book, but he has said that previously. Hard to say. Trump, Musk, I don't know, duck, rabbit, one or the other. One of them, anyway, is in charge, going to run things for us and make everything better. Now, clearly, we part ways in that question of how to respond to the current moment. Why? Partly that history is false in his book. It is not the case that autocracies over the course of history have delivered good for human beings. They have consistently violated freedom. And I will come back to that point. I want you to focus on the idea of freedom and what it is worth to you. The second point is that egalitarianism is not the weak-minded invention of the 20th century. Egalitarianism has been with us for millennia, has been growing in force, goes all the way back to antiquity. Christianity extended it. Already in the early 1600s, you had indentured servants who struck for the right to vote in Jamestown. That same spirit showed up in Plymouth. Ditto the spirit of egalitarianism for all human creatures, Africans as well as everybody else. The Declaration of Independence was earnest in its commitment to equality. It led to the abolition of enslavement in Massachusetts, as well as in Pennsylvania and Vermont before the end of the Revolutionary War. Rhode Island had already rejected racial hierarchy before the Revolutionary War. In other words, it is not a weak-minded idea of the 20th century. What it does, rather, is reflect the claim of ordinary people to freedom. That's all. It's that simple. That's what egalitarianism means. Freedom is both the power to steer my own life in my private circumstances and to contribute with others to steering the public life and shape that constrains us all, the norms and laws. If you love freedom, there is only one possibility, because every unaccountable, and no absolute power is ever accountable. That's the definition of absolute power, is it is not accountable. No absolute power is ever accountable. Absolute power inevitably corrupts, tramples on, persecutes freedom. So the question that we have right now is not whether to have democracy and the protection of freedom, but only how to have that. The only question is, can we redesign our institutions to achieve that? And we can. And the single most useful thing that we could immediately do is party reform. Get rid of party primaries, get rid of the capture of power by political parties that work on the basis of a shrinking base of population to control our institutions. We, the people, need our power back. And with that, we can, in fact, redesign our institutions for effective functioning.
Thank you, Professor Allen. Mr. Yarvin, your response and your own presentation.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone who made this event possible. Professor Allen, of course, showed a lot of courage here and a lot of hard work. I'd like to also thank, Harvard University. We're not supposed to mention the name of the school?
Unclear.
Unclear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this possible, including the school where we are, including Passage Press, my publisher, including the John Adams Society, woohoo, out there in the public. And yeah, I think it's sort of a great opportunity to kind of test my views against Professor Allen. I guess I would say, I grew up in a sort of very different context. I grew up inside what's called the deep state sometimes, because my father was a foreign service officer and my mother worked at the DOE, and my stepfather actually worked on the Hill for many years and now teaches at Hopkins SAIS. And he worked for Biden actually for a while. And when I observed sort of the underbelly of this system from the inside, it did not seem to have very much to do with the kind of abstractions that Professor Allen talks about. And so in a way, I have kind of two preliminary responses to Professor Allen's narrative. One is that, reading her book, and I was reading, Democracy. Was Democracy is a Path to Justice? Is the
Other way around, my friend.
Justice is a Path to Democracy.
Justice by means of democracy.
Justice by means of democracy. And reading that, I was sort of like, it made me feel like I was reading, in a way, a work of Islamic history that was written by a Muslim. And I'm like, because this is someone who believes entirely in the system that she's describing. And so, not to, of course, have any negative discussion of the Muslim faith, but the thing is, if I'm reading a Muslim history of, say, the Abbasids of Damascus in the 9th century, written by a Muslim, I expect them to be very concerned with, is this the true caliph? Is this the real Islam? And so on and so forth. None of which, as a non-Muslim, are questions that really relate to me. And so when I read, for example, A Justice by Means of Democracy, I sort of notice every chapter starting with, there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. And I'm like, I get it, this is what you believe in. But these abstractions seem uncorrelated with the realities. And what this reminded me the most, besides this observation about Islamic history, is it reminded me of one of the books that I really learned political philosophy from, because I'm an adherent of what's called the Italian school of political philosophy. And there was a great, great introduction to this, which I found by chance in a used bookstore, which is James Burnham's The Machiavellians. And The Machiavellian starts with, I think, one of the great political essays of all time, which it is a takedown of Dante. And it is a review of Dante's book, De Monarchia. And Burnham, who was at the time metamorphosing from a Trotskyist into a neocon, and he was one of the first to make that transformation. This book is written in 1940. Looks at this, he reads De Monarchia, which is a book of political theory by none other than Dante, and he summarizes the arguments of De Monarchia in a way that sort of describes these kind of very, very lofty abstractions. And then he's like, all right, you can't even process these abstractions, let's process the reality. And so the reality is, instead of talking about abstractions, what Dante is really talking about is the conflict between two political factions, known as the white Guelphs and the black Guelphs, I believe. And all of these abstractions are basically Dante's way of saying, I forget if this is the white Guelphs or the black Guelphs that Dante is a member of, but it sort of reduces to a very specific set of political behaviors. So I think when I looked at sort of the reality in which I lived, I noticed sort of abstractions like democracy that are used in ways that, seem very, I think tendentious is not too, difficult to word. And so, for example, when I read Professor Allen's, definition of democracy, she seems to define democracy, almost the word, the symbol, as a good. And then defining the symbol, what constitutes democracy, it's not simply having elections, it's principles like difference without domination, it's basically principles of you can't be a democracy just having elections and electing leaders who, take office and exercise power because they won the election. That's not democracy. Oh no, democracy is sort of all of these intangible things that go along with this. And I'm like, is this the world's longest case of no true Scotsman? Because actually, if I'm going about to defining a Scotsman, I might say it's someone who was born in Scotland or someone who's a Scottish citizen or sort of simple cases like this. And when I define democracy, I'm like, there's a very simple question. How democratic is this country? And my answer to that is simply taking this not, going back and separating the is-ought distinction and saying, I'm like, how much power do the voters have? If the voters have no power at all, for example, in the EU, they'll frequently talk of the democratic deficit, indicating that actually the parliament, the European Parliament that's elected by the voters, is almost entirely symbolic and has no power. And actually, the real Europe is run by the European Commission, which is accountable to nobody, like the Supreme Court. And so actually, or like Harvard. And so, what we see people defending when they defend democracy, so-called, is they'll use terms like civil society, or they'll say our institutions. And these things seem to me to have nothing at all to do with giving power to elections. So, for example, I may be somewhere in the book, but I did not find any recognition in Professor Allen's book of the fact that the House of Representatives, the so-called home of democracy as defined by the founders, has a 98% incumbency rate. Or that if you're a freshman representative in the House of Representatives, you start at the very bottom. And so actually it seems to me that if I look at the real Congress, this is actually a buffer against democracy, against populism, as you might say, because when I hear the word populism, I view that as a synonym for democracy. And no, I don't think of it as a good thing. And so actually that difference over the meaning of the word democracy seems to me to be what we should focus on tonight.
Professor Allen, your response?
Well, for starters, I appreciate so much that you've understood that there's conviction in my book. You're quite right that there is conviction in my book. Nihilistic narcissism is not my jam. Maybe yours, it's not my jam. So let's talk about democracy specifically. And in order to do that, we have to dig deeper into the meaning of freedom and also the meaning of equality and precisely what it is we're trying to protect. As I begin to do that, let me though also say, I also think there's a problem with the incumbency rate, for sure. Why did I highlight party reform? Precisely because we don't really have competitive elections any longer. So I agree that in many ways our democracy is not functioning to the standard of democracy. Again, that's where we agree. The divergence is in whether the question is regime change to unaccountable CEO monarchs, Trump and Musk, or renovating our democracy. Now, again, back to the root and to the meaning. One of the things that Mr. Yarvin likes to focus on and insist on is that human difference is fundamental and that we should organize our way of thinking about society based on structures of, again, racial hierarchy. And he introduces DNA as the proof of that point. Now, and he introduces these points as refutations of egalitarianism. Egalitarianism precedes human difference. There is no such thing as human difference without the category of the human, right? Now, what is it about the category of the human that we are all members of? That category captures the fact that each of us is a judging creature. We have moral capacity, and we're all trying to make tomorrow better than yesterday. We choose moment by moment, day by day, because we're trying to make tomorrow better than yesterday. In choosing being moral creatures, we are activating our freedom, expressing our desire for it. It is the core of our basic human dignity and what requires protection in order to achieve human flourishing. That is the fundamental ground, the conviction. So yes, there is conviction in my book, 100%. But that conviction is grounded on recognizing, again, that human equality precedes human difference. Now, this is not to say that we are all the same. To the contrary, we come in all kinds of different sizes and shapes and colors and capacities and etc. We are so various, and that is the beauty of humanity. But we can talk about and appreciate human difference only because of human equality. And then also we have to recognize, of course, that groups are changeable and various, that how people connect evolves over time, and it is impossible to say what strivings and what talents land where within the population. And the only way we can maximize the value of human beings is to maximize our protection of freedom. That's it. And so, what protects freedom? Governing ourselves in our private sphere and governing together with others in the public sphere. And there's only one name for that: democracy. All the rest is a question of engineering. That is what he's really asking about, Mr. Yarvin here, is really asking questions about engineering. And yes, we have a heck of a lot of engineering improvements to bring to our democracy.
Mr. Yarvin, a question for you. Obviously, this topic of accountability within your proposed system, that's obviously a question everyone has. You know, how you deal with that problem, namely, how do you make some kind of strong executive, how do you hold him accountable, properly speaking?
I thought that was the second part of the debate.
No, the second part's about Harvard itself and what Harvard represents, and you know, in
all right.
this
Well,
sort of elite formation
let
institution.
let me take a step back and kind of let me first respond to Professor Allen's point about equality, which consists of what I would say a lot of relatively unfalsifiable abstractions. To slightly sharpen the point, I would say that if we consider the statement, all men or all human beings are created equal, we can consider that as an abstract expression of philosophy, as a kind of confession of religious faith, or we can consider that as an empirical statement. If we were to consider it as an empirical statement, I would say, okay, if you consider that true, here's a much more true statement: all identical twins are created equal. And
What does that mean?
I mean that all identical twins are basically born genetically equal with the same capacities and the same needs and the same goals. I completely reject the idea that all human beings are, sure, we have many things in common, but the regime, the way of living, one of the basic truths of essentially classical political philosophy, which is being rediscovered to this day, is that there is no system of government that is appropriate for all peoples at all times. And you know, as a reductio ad absurdum, I would point to the question of uncontacted tribes. Okay, what is right for the citizens of Greater Andaman Island? Okay, should we invade the Andaman Islands? Should we take away their bows? Should we give them the right to vote? What about the citizens of uncontacted tribes in the Amazon? Is it right for them to be basically rounded up, issued with ballots, and told to vote for the president of Brazil? Will that really be the thing that helps them, basically choosing between Lula and Bolsonaro Jr.? No, I don't think that that's what these people need. And my standard of government goes back to Alexander Pope, who had this great line, for forms of government, let fools contest, whatever governs best is best. I think I messed that up a little. And so when I look at the objective results of governance in this country today, I can't help but observe, our burned out, desolate inner cities. I can't help, but observe there are numerous places in this country where you can go that were clearly flourishing 50 years ago that are no longer flourishing. And in my standard of government, I basically return to Thomas Carlyle's idea of the condition of England question. And this is an explicit kind of renunciation of statistics. You say that, when you consider the condition of England or the condition of anywhere, look at them and say, how are these people living? Is the government helping them to flourish? Is it helping them to live well? I think one of the things that I noticed most closely in Professor Allen's work is that there's this returning emphasis to what might be called a positive liberty, or the liberties of the ancients, which is essentially this idea that exercising political power is a matter of birthright and is a matter of being very important to the nature of a human being in a civilized society. I'm with Charles I on this, who said, a subject and a sovereign are clean different things. I actually believe that there is a natural desire for political power that is essential not only in our human ancestry, but actually in our simian ancestry, because we observe that chimpanzees live in a very similar way. If you want to be a chimpanzee who spreads his DNA, you better be the chief chimp. And so this desire for power, this importance, this sort of lust for mattering. Everyone who writes an admissions, essay to Harvard, wants to make an impact on the world. They want to change the world. They want to do all these things. They want power. And and for me, that desire for power, which seems to Professor Allen to be a very positive thing and a thing that is entirely benign, I see that actually as a kind of lust, really almost as a sin that is sort of caused great damage to the world and the lives of those now living.
I assume you'd like to respond.
I will. Is there time still? Yep. Alrighty. No, I would like to, because I'd like to clear up a couple of confusions. So the first is about the term equality, and the second is about the term power. So, for starters, equality. Equality comes in a variety of forms. It's really important. Anytime somebody wants to talk to you about equality or egalitarianism, ask them what kind of equality they mean. They may be talking about human moral equality. They may be talking about political equality. They may be talking about social equality. They may be talking about intellectual equality. They may be talking about economic equality, etc. In other words, you don't know what somebody means by equality or egalitarianism until you ask them precisely which concept of equality they're using. Human beings are morally equal in the way that I described. We are all members of the same species. Even those identical twins are morally equal to each other. They are also equal to each other in some other ways that most other human beings are not equal to each other in, but let's not confuse our different concepts of equality. That's really important. And again, anytime you hear anybody critique egalitarianism, ask them to account for what account of equality precisely are they critiquing. And if they can't offer an accurate account of the theory of equality or egalitarianism they're critiquing, you should pass that argument by. So that's the first point.
Can I ask a quick check on that?
No, let me make the second point, and then you can come back, because you had a lot in what you said. So let me just make the point about power. Couple different categories here. Freedom, self-government, power, and domination. What Mr. Yarvin is attributing to me in the treatment of power is actually the concept of domination. Yes, human beings are beset with a drive to dominate others. We watch that all around us all the time. We're probably watching it in this debate right now between the two of us, coming from both of us in relationship to each other, for sure. Human beings are beset by the desire to dominate. That is a bad feature of human beings. Why? Because the desire to dominate impedes the desire and aspiration for freedom coming from somebody else. The goal, as we seek to protect and support human flourishing, is in fact to achieve spheres of agency for ourselves, for all of us, that we all are able to be full agents. And there is only one way to do that, again, by protecting our private sphere and by giving us the opportunity to co-create the public sphere. It is the only solution to the problem of domination. So no, when I am arguing for political equality, I'm not arguing for domination. I am arguing for a sharing of power in order to protect freedom for all of us morally equal human beings.
On moral equality and power is fine.
On moral equality and power. So sort of trying to tease apart some of these, I would say, relatively tendentious definitions. First of all, there's a useful thought experiment here. Surely Professor Allen would not expect, extend the principle of moral equality to chimpanzees. And yet chimpanzees are our cousins. They are, completely related to us, all of us except, I would imagine, except Darwin in this room. And there is, of course, a continuous genetic chain of linkage that traces us back to our simian friends. And so, one of the things, and actually of all people who observed this, it was Stephen Jay Gould, the communist evolutionary biologist, who observed this. Harvard communist evolutionary biologist, Marxist at least, and he observed, a curious fact, which is that actually there are a lot of missing links between us and the chimpanzee. There's Homo habilis, there's Australopithecus, afarensis, and we would have a lot of trouble if those more divergent forms were living among us today of deciding, do they deserve moral equality? And so my question, my sort of thought experiment question for Professor Allen is if we were able to decode the genome of, let's say, Homo habilis, who lived, 2 million years ago, and somehow implant that in a human cell like those dire wolves you keep hearing about, and would that be a being with this moral equality that Professor Allen describes? Because if humanness is a Boolean quality, as we say in computer science, if it's 0 or 1, there must have been a mother who was not morally equal to us, who had a child who was morally equal to us. And I'm curious as to how that process worked and how her theory deals with that. Secondly, when it comes to power, it's very interesting. We've heard Professor Allen, praising humanity to the skies here, but then we discover that actually this very essential element of human nature, the desire to dominate, the libido dominandi, as they say, is an essential quality of humanity, and Professor Allen thinks it's bad. She actually wants to reform humanity. She wants to create what used to be called the new Soviet man that would not have that desire. What I observe when I take Aristotle's 3 forms of government, monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy, the rule of the one, the rule of the few, and the rule of the many. And I think Aristotle kind of made a mistake by saying, okay, there's 6 forms, there's a good form and a bad form of each. I really like them as neutral qualities because I think all of those sort of forms of power, and they are all forms of power, are very, very important. And the principles, I would translate monarchy, oligarchy, democracy in today's terms into the principles of authority or authoritarianism. I translate oligarchy as a concept near and dear here at a university that will not be named, as meritocracy or prestige, and I translate democracy as popularity or populism. And so what I see is that all of these forms are active today, and those who believe that our society should be ruled by prestige, by prestigious institutions, by civil society, are very, very against authority. But what you notice is that actually those institutions are quite unaccountable. Nobody elected Anthony Fauci. Nobody elected Anthony Fauci when he basically supervised the program to invent COVID. Nobody elected Anthony Fauci when he covered it up. Nobody elected Anthony Fauci when he told us to stand 6 feet apart based on some science fair project that nobody actually knows where that number came from. And so actually, delegating this authority to prestige, which seemed like a no-brainer earlier in the 20th century, seems like maybe there's actually flaws in meritocracy. Maybe there's flaws in relying on prestige. And so when we look at what we call democracy today, what I see it as essentially as a sort of guided democracy, the way we talk about Putin's democracy. Putin's democracy is democracy guided by monarchy. Our democracy is democracy guided in the formula that Walter Lippmann came up with about 100 years ago, is democracy guided by prestige, guided by civil society. And I'd like us to address that squarely.
Sure. Professor Allen, just also given time, perhaps if we could focus particularly on what you described as the engineering problems of democracy, which Mr. Yarvin seemed to kind of bring out in the second half of the
Well,
that
I know
answer.
we were also drifting into our second topic there too, which we're probably
little
getting
bit.
close
Yeah,
to in time.
yeah.
So I'll just make a very brief comment about Aristotle because I cannot let it go by having a hash made of Aristotle. That is something I cannot abide because I am very fond of Aristotle. So it's really important. Those 6 forms matter a lot in Aristotle: monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. The division between the good and bad is the difference between rule for the sake of the people who are ruled versus for the sake of the ruler. And the thing that Aristotle thinks will achieve rule for the sake of the ruler, or rather the ruled, the people who are being ruled, and get them good government, is law, limits, and accountability. All right? So that distinction in Aristotle is absolutely critical. The difference is really between tyranny and monarchy, which is a good form because limited, because bound. And monarchies can be limited and bound. Take British constitutional monarchy, take how it developed in the 18th and 19th century. It has produced a form of good rule and good governance for people. Democracy is not the only form that can do that, but limit, rule, those things are necessary in rule of law.
Got it. All right. I think, given where you were going, we could get a little bit into our second topic, which deals directly with Harvard, but it could be interpreted broadly, as Mr. Yarvin was saying, as prestige institutions or civil society. The main question here, resolved: Harvard's model of elite formation, grounded in a contested balance between merit and equality, undermines the democratic legitimacy of the political and cultural systems its graduates go on to shape. Now, given how the coin toss went, Mr. Yarvin, you're allowed to speak first.
All right. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, as we say. One of the things I was curious, to sort of see answered in Professor Allen's book, and maybe I didn't see it, but I was sort of curious as to whether, Professor Allen's ideal of democracy supports a Harvard admissions department that judges applicants by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. And I think that that's a critically important question for these institutions, because of course when we see Harvard taking the role of elite formation, we're essentially looking at the naked reality of an essentially oligarchic institution. Obviously, Harvard, founded in 1636, is considerably older than the United States of America, and I don't think anyone has ever suggested holding Harvard accountable to voters in any sense. In fact, I think most people at Harvard would be repulsed at the idea of letting elected politicians, soiled by filthy democracy, choose Harvard's admissions department. And I think that that's sort of a reflection on the way that this term democracy has drifted so far from its literal meaning. And of course, Professor Allen is I'm sure aware that for most of the history of the term democracy, it was considered a negative term. The founders used the term democracy to mean what we now call ochlocracy, essentially, the bad form, rule by mobs for the mob's own interest, as you might say. And when I look at the way that our system works today, whether it's by the permanent administrative state, which is, like Anthony Fauci, and there are many Faucis out there, is absolutely shielded from democratic accountability. Moreover, attempts to return that to the accountability of the voters under the complicated and not entirely successful regime of the elected president Donald Trump have been met with really great resistance. And so when I look at this system, I'm basically like, we find the word democracy being used to actually mean oligarchy. And that strikes me as very, very Orwellian. And I would like to know what is not Orwellian about that.
Professor Allen?
Well, there is a lot to unpack there, as Mr. Yarvin said. So maybe just let's get some facts laid out first, and then we can come to the question of what we should all be hoping for from our great universities. So Massachusetts is in fact the actual founder of Harvard College and has the final authority for Harvard College. And the state legislature directly did take responsibility for Harvard through the middle of the 19th century. So in that regard, one can't say that it has never been the case, that there has been very direct and clear civic connection for Harvard. And to this day, without any question, the university carries a very strong sense of responsibility for its community. Does it always act successfully in relationship to that responsibility? No, it does not. and there is plenty of work for reform internally in our universities. So that's the first thing to say. Second thing to say is about the relationship between universities and democracy more generally. What should be our goals? What is the history of that? How can we get it right in the present day? The Harvard College was set up in the wake of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, also actually having across its schools established public education, whose main purpose was civic education, and the development of civic strength. The purpose was to make sure that young people understood the laws. Why? Again, to protect freedom so that nobody would be subject to arbitrary treatment because they wouldn't understand the laws. So from the very beginning, the project of education in Massachusetts Bay Colony and the state of Massachusetts ultimately was, again, the project of freedom connected to the structure of the law, and with education institutions having the job precisely of cultivating the kind of civic strength, both of knowledge and relationship, that could support a healthy, self-governing society. Now, this idea was not just an idea of the colonies, it was also an idea that George Washington was, again, one of the first people to pick up. George Washington wanted to found a national university, and in his aspiration for that university, it would have people from every single state there. That is to say, he sought geographic distribution because his belief was the education that would yield civic strength for a healthy republic, a healthy constitutional democracy, would in fact weave together peoples from across the country. I go through all of this to make the point that the resolution as crafted has a false premise in it. It has in it the premise that egalitarianism and excellence are in tension with each other. They can be, they don't have to be. Excellence and talent are everywhere, and it should be the job of great universities to find that talent wherever it might be. If you didn't find a defense of affirmative action in my book, it's because I have not defended affirmative action. Not now, not over the past 10 years. What I have defended is the idea that universities should have a merit threshold, and above that threshold have a lottery by geographic or socioeconomic categories. So yes, there are lots of different ways to approach the question of how precisely we do admissions, but what is above all important is that as we think about the role of universities in our collective life in this country, the job is, yes, to provide research and knowledge and innovation that support national security, that support economic competitiveness and health, but also that just gives, I'd say, a two-legged bench when we should have a three-legged stool. We also need our universities to cultivate civic strength. That does require our ability to weave relationships on our campuses among all members of our democratic community across all kinds of backgrounds, including differences of viewpoint and perspective. So there's a heck of a lot to say, but without any question, the ability to protect the life of the mind is also central to protecting freedom. That's the work that we have to focus on.
I hear a lot of abstractions there. They're very beautiful abstractions, but in order to make some of the history concrete, let me tell a brief history story here. Does anyone in the room recognize the name Robert Califf? Wow, back room, we got one way in the back with the beanie. All right, what about the name Increase Mather? What about the name Cotton Mather? There we go. Cotton Mather has and as a failed child prodigy myself, I have enormous respect for this. Cotton Mather, besides being the son of Increase Mather, Harvard president, was actually the youngest person ever to matriculate at Harvard, and he entered Harvard at the age of 11. He was generally recognized as a genius. He was also the son of the president of Harvard. They respected, heredity in those days as well. Cotton Mather expected to become the president of Harvard, but he never did. And here is why, which is that, are you familiar with the Salem witch trials? So it turns out that the Salem witch trials were, an epiphenomenon of Puritanism, we've all heard the phrase, till the stock of the Puritans fail, was an epiphenomenon of the radical Puritanism that erupted in Massachusetts after the end of the Dominion of New England, the overthrow of James II, and of Governor Andros. And many phenomena that were very strange and bizarre, such as the belief in witchcraft, the idea of what was called spectral evidence, really flourished in New England at this time. Of course, Harvard was quite an old institution at that time. And the way in which the witch craze ended was really remarkable. It was due to this one man, Robert Califf, who was a merchant. He was not an academic. He was basically a citizen of Boston, and he was like, this is crazy. And he wrote a book called More Wonders of the Invisible World, which is a commentary on Mather's book, Wonders of the Invisible World, which is all about the action of demons. He could not get this book published in Massachusetts. He had it published in England, and it was brought back to Massachusetts, and there, I think in the year, sometime in the 1690s, I forget the exact date, that book was burned in Harvard Yard by Cotton Mather. And yet, basically, Harvard's ideal of veritas, truth, seems to be much more important than all of the other ideals Professor Allen has regarded put together. And I think the lesson of Robert Califf, who brought about the end of the witch craze single-handedly by standing up and speaking the truth and being unpopular, being canceled, as you might say, was that he was like, you know what? Actually, I believe in Harvard's ideals more strongly than Harvard does at the moment. And I will basically come to Harvard, I will come to the people of Massachusetts, and I will try to restore these ideals. And the witch craze ended. Cotton Mather attempted to sort of spin it. And he was like, oh, I was really a moderate witch hunter. I didn't believe in spectral evidence in all cases. But his reputation was permanently tarnished as a result of the witch trials, and he never became president of Harvard. And so, I find that very inspiring in a way, because I see that these fundamentally aristocratic and completely non-democratic institutions are actually capable of that level of self-renewal. And that's what I hope for. That's what I hope to see when I come to Harvard or another university of similar reputation, is that I hope to see that genius for self-renewal there. And I think that genius has to sort of contend against the corruption of the immense power that Harvard has and its immense ability to set public policy. And I think that power has corrupted the mission of truth.
Professor Allen.
Well, I think you'd find much agreement that the spirit of renewal is to be welcomed on our campus and on other campuses. I think that's not a controversial point. And the question really is what the work is to be done. It seems to me that America's universities do need a new social contract with the people of America. And there are a few elements to that. For starters, it is important that as a part of working on that renewal, we also all recognize the importance of defending academic freedom, freedom of inquiry, and the private rights, constitutional rights of civil society institutions. I will use that phrase, civil society, universities being anchor to the fabric of civil society, and civil society being, in fact, the space for freedom. And as we work on defending those things, then their question is, where also do we need to work on renewal? We have fallen short, I would say, because of the problem of technocracy. The problem of technocracy is the problem of expertise disconnected from real realities, what people are experiencing, and without the humility that goes with making recommendations for the world at large, the inability to test them appropriately with the full range of stakeholders and perspectives. That is something that we do need to improve on without any question. We also certainly need to improve on our ability to provide opportunity and to establish clarity that there is fairness in our procedures for admission. I've already alluded to my own approach, an approach I've been arguing for more than a decade. But with regard to opportunity, we have to tackle the problem of cost. I believe we ought to be experimenting with 3-year degrees instead of 4-year degrees, which would bring the expense burden down considerably, quite rapidly for families. We would also be able to have more people come to campus if we were able to deliver an education in 3 years. And that would give us the opportunity both to serve more, but also to connect more broadly across the fabric of our country and our society. And then lastly, I'll repeat myself, I think we really have to be able to educate for civic strength, and that means beginning the picture of our education, our work, by recognizing that our context and our goal is to be oriented by the ideal of pluralism. We are a pluralistic society. We bring to our campus people from all backgrounds, of all kinds. We're diverse in our identities and our ideologies. And in that context, the goal is to develop a culture where we're capable of civil disagreement, mutual learning, hard and difficult discussions across lines of difference, and able to cultivate, I would argue for, a culture of mutual commitment to one another, holding each other with mutual respect, but also shared commitment to constitutional democracy, constitutionalism, rule of law, nonviolence, and full inclusion. So that is all work I think we need to do to establish a new social contract between ourselves, Harvard, and the rest of America's universities, and the American people.
Perhaps on the point of technocracy within prestige institutions like Harvard.
Sure. Well, I don't believe in pluralism. I believe in veritas. And to the extent that pluralism between truth and error is no pluralism at all. On the subject of pluralism, though, I would say that there's a line from Burke in that a constitution is a contract between the dead and the living. And one of the things that we see basically in our own time, and one of the things I was very shocked to discover by just getting into a lot of the primary reading ourselves, is the immense narrowing in the set of permissible political and social perspectives that has taken place not just in this country over the last 10 or 20 years, but over the last 100, 200, 300 years. There are many, many perspectives that are simply no longer represented in this world that were, I think of, the trial of Julius Evola after World War II, where he said he was charged for his convictions, and he said, "My convictions are only what everyone considered right and natural before the French Revolution." And I don't really see the convictions of Julius Evola or Joseph de Maistre, well represented at Harvard, which is not a problem if they're erroneous. But if they're not erroneous, then there is indeed a problem. And in terms of the, the question of technocracy and the sort of the effect of power on Harvard, I'd like to come back to this case of COVID because I think it actually tells us an enormous amount about the way our society is governed. I would say that COVID, really is sending us the same message about the way we are governed that Chernobyl sent to the Soviet Union, except it killed a lot more people than Chernobyl. We can't really ignore the fact that virology invented COVID. We can't really ignore the fact that the best virologists, the top virologists, both created it and covered it up. And when we look at the cause of that, blaming individuals, scapegoating individuals, saying, oh, this is Fauci's fault, I don't believe that at all. I believe that it is actually a fault of the system. And what I observe of this system is that it is essentially the way that science is governed in the post-war society is to say, okay, here you're a scientist, you're not here to just be abstractly curious, you're here to solve a problem. And what they wound up doing when saying, scientists, you're here to solve a problem, is that they created a culture of grantsmanship where a virologist, is out there to say, wow, there's a very serious problem and I deserve public funds for solving this problem. And that went from SARS-1 being a serious problem to saying, oh, well, more coronaviruses could mutate to become dangerous, viruses, to saying, well, let's mutate these viruses ourselves to kind of help them along to show what could happen accidentally in nature. And so they sort of, transgressed from basically being there to cure viruses to being there to create viruses. And then they realized early in 2020, and if you look at their Slack messages, you'll see this, they realized very clearly that it was very likely that this had come out of Wuhan. Yes, it was a Chinese experiment, but it was actually a Western, sort of research project. And then they made this very, very culpable decision to really behave in an essentially criminal way and cover that up. And so when you look at the incentives of experts, I want to sort of go back and say, again, you have these three forms of governance. You have authority, governance by command, by domination, as Professor Allen would say. You have governance by prestige, and you have governance by popularity. And the initial progressives who established this system, in 1900, the idea of professors setting public policy was unheard of. And people looked at the result of actual democracy, where elected politicians set policy, and they were like, this is corrupt, this is incompetent. Everything people say about Donald Trump, they said about William McKinley. They may be a little more right about Trump than they were about McKinley. I wouldn't say that. But yeah, they looked at American aristocrats of the period, looked at the Gilded Age. They looked at what was called the Great Barbecue. They looked at the idea, okay, this is real democracy. If you put elected politicians in charge of the government, that's the literal word democracy. And they were like, this is terrible. And who can save us from this? And so, you know, the answer of a king wasn't available to them at that time. And so they're like, all right, what if we put the professors in charge? What if we put the experts in charge? What if we put the old aristocrats in charge? What if we put the smartest people in charge? And this seemed absolutely infallible to them. And they did not realize how much that exercise of power would in fact corrupt these people, to the point where it basically led essentially well-meaning non-evil virologists to invent a pandemic that killed 20 million people and then cover it up. And I think that that lesson exists across the board in all of these areas of public policy. I view the Ukraine war as a tragedy very, very similar to the tragedy of COVID. It's basically unaccountable public policy on, with nothing to stop it. And the fact that these structures are oligarchic and based on prestige rather than authority do not mean that they do not have power, and do not mean that they do not have the power to misgovern.
Are professors in charge? Is his standard for what makes a professor, is that right? Those sorts of questions.
Well, we know for a fact professors aren't in charge because, obviously. But anyway, I'll come back to that in a second, but I want to go back to the very beginning of that set of remarks when Mr. Yarvin suggested that pluralism and veritas are in conflict with each other. That's not the case. To protect freedom is to generate diversity of thought. James Madison said that. Old idea, others have said it as well. And so to protect freedom and is to generate precisely what you need in order to pursue veritas, namely the conflict of ideas required for competitive consideration of hard questions that are rarely given to certain conclusions. So in that regard, actually pluralism is something that helps advance the cause of veritas. Respecting pluralism and protecting pluralism is beneficial to the project of discovery. The project of discovery always benefits from adversarial structures and competitive structures. And so, yes, there's always room for the enterprise of science to improve itself. And no, the professors are certainly not in charge, but who can deny that expertise brings with it a certain kind of power? But again, it's a very specific kind of power. And the question is, how does it sit in relationship to other kinds of power? There, I think the best way of understanding what our goal should be is actually to go back to Aristotle, who gave us a beautiful account of the different kinds of knowledge and expertise that people bring to bear. So again, when he's talking about his different regime types, partly the different regime types also put different kinds of knowledge offerings on the shared table of society. So the people bring things in particular. They bring clarity about values for society. They also bring clarity about their desire to play a role and for what reasons they have for flourishing. The oligarchy category in the ancient sense brings clarity about honor and privileges and rights and things like that. And then in Aristotle's account, the monarchs are those who do bring that trained expertise. Society can generate these things differently in a variety of different ways, but the point is we need all of it. We do actually need the clarity about values that come from the perspective of ordinary people. We also need trained expertise. We also need to ensure that the pathway to participating in that world of trained expertise is broadly open. And that is a competitive pathway, and that the work that comes out of it is developed in competitive and adversarial structures of engagement. So at any rate, that was a mouthful, I realize, but no, in general, professors are not in charge, but expertise and ordinary knowledge, the knowledge of common people, can work well together when we build the right structures for pulling them together.
Let me hone in. It seems like I feel like this debate has been a success because we've honed in on what I would say is the most important point, which is essentially the functioning of the marketplace of ideas. And the marketplace of ideas, when it works well, is essentially a Darwinian system in which good ideas, exactly, I don't like using the word that starts with a D, but in which you have a variety of ideas, like mutations in a Darwinian system, and it's the survival of the fittest. And those systems work well when the definition of fittest is actually the definition that you want. And the essential problem when you have scientists kind of puttering around in their laboratories, breeding beans with other beans, and they're like, look, wow, it works like this. The fittest ideas in that, bucolic condition of 19th century science are simply the truest ideas. You were evolving, you were selecting for veritas. When I look at the way that expertise has worked in the 20th century, ever since public policy started being dictated by ideas at Harvard, what I see is actually very different from that. And again, I'm going to use virology as an example. Within virology, the Robert Califfs of virology did exist before COVID. And there were actually people who very bravely stood up and said, no, you should not be doing gain-of-function research. There is actually nothing to be gained from gain-of-function research. We found that actually nothing was gained at all from this research when COVID was created. They were like, we're gonna predict these emergences of viruses, okay? You predicted it, it happened, now what? Did you learn anything? No, you didn't, right? And actually, what you find is that what you're evolving for in basically the system of grant-funded science is science that gets more grants. And so gain of function, imagine being a biologist who's against gain-of-function research. You were not a team player. You were trying to deny grants to all of your friends. You were saying, don't work on this. And they're basically saying, look, but I have this beautiful research that I'm doing, and it's explained by this idea that sort of the 1918 flu should be a problem. So let's go and reinvent the 1918 flu. Actually, I forget the name, but something very disturbing happened in the supposedly anti-academic Trump administration, which is, I think, the deputy head of NIAID, the Infectious Diseases Institute, is actually the gain-of-function guy who recreated the 1918 flu, which hasn't gotten out and hurt us yet, but very well might. And so, when I look at this, I'm like, wow, if the professors aren't in charge, even electing Donald Trump doesn't seem to have stopped the gain of function, basically, world. What I see is that gain of function research, like so many other research programs, has a built-in bureaucratic advantage because it generates funding. And there are so many basically directions in research and public policy where it is not the direction of veritas, that wins. It is the direction of, if you'll excuse my Latin, monetas. And that money is not, it's not corporate, bribery or whatever. It's just the fact that everyone in science, and this is, by the way, the reason that I personally dropped out of science, is that I realized that to be a good scientist today, to be an effective PI in the system, you have to be an empire builder. And I'm just not an empire builder. It's just not me, right? And so what we have is this generation of very effective bureaucrats, the Faucis, the Ralph Barracks, the Peter Daszaks, the people who really, honestly, right now should be in jail for what they did. And instead, they have suffered little or no harm. EcoHealth Alliance, which basically ran, the research program under Peter Daszak, was disbarred, or, they can't get grants anymore. Peter Daszak is like, fine, we'll shut it down. We'll start a new organization, different name, should be fine. Actually, these people seem profoundly unaccountable. And if you look at the processes that gave them power, and really the power to create COVID, they seem very, very corrupt. And I see essentially many, many things. Who benefits from expansion of NATO to the east? Well, I don't know who benefits, but I know a lot of people have died. How's that working out for you, Ukraine? When I look at the social policies of the 1960s, which were supported by almost all academics. And I look at basically, Professor Allen was talking about the legacy of devastation that these policies have left over the last 50 years. They were all approved by the best social scientists of the time. I see the same effect where the system is not evolving the best and truest ideas, it's involving the most powerful ideas and, in a way, the most pernicious ideas. And I can't help but relate that to Professor Allen's belief that positive liberty, in other words, power, is an essential goal of human nature.
Sure, your response, Professor Allen, whether or not what he said is factually or historically correct, if there's something structurally wrong which is producing what he claims to be the case about professors and academic elites of that sort?
So there's a lot there, so I'm not going to respond to the whole picture there. I think that's not what our resolution is about. But I will say a few things. I mean, for starters, science is a hard enterprise, and science is also a bureaucratic enterprise. Both of those things are true simultaneously. Scientists do work according to a set of norms for inquiry that are of a very high standard, is short of it. And they hold each other to a very high standard, and they do put each other under intense competitive pressures. Is it possible that bureaucratic pressures are also affecting how science unfolds? Yes. Should science take a look at itself and consider how it's doing its work? Yes. I think all those things are the case. But sciences generally have established very high standards for their work and maintain a commitment to testing and evaluating what they're doing. But I think the important question here, more broadly, just to bring us back to our original resolution, is whether or not this university in particular is in a place where it can do work that is for the good of our society. And the answer to that question is yes. And the reason for that answer is because we are very clear about core values. Those are values of veritas. They are also values of pluralism. Again, those things are mutually supportive of each other. And it is possible both to stand up for and defend values of academic freedom and intellectual freedom, and also to put yourself on a path of reform and renewal. We can defend by renovating, and that is, I believe, the path that we're on.
All right, perhaps we can get into closing statements. I think they've allotted 5 to 10, perhaps it was 8 minutes. Mr. Yarvin, if you'd like to start your closing remarks.
So maybe I can, in my closing remarks, I could do something a little unusual and kind of argue Professor Allen's side, for the moment, because I think we've seen sort of maybe a little too little of. I've been making the case, and I would like to think somewhat successfully, against oligarchy. Not as an abstract system, because of course we've seen, all of the three forms can work in their own way in different societies, in different structures. Another name for, the positive name for oligarchy is aristocracy. I think Harvard has always, tried to represent, the rule of the best. And, even you see it recovering from the witch craze of the 1690s. You see it recovering from the wokeness craze of the 2020s. And I think it is capable of recovering, and I want to see it recover. And one of the lessons, one of the things that I say to basically people who are on, my side, not that I'm a partisan, I'm just an intellectual. One of the things that I say, to people on my side when I encounter these elite institutions is I'm like, you sort of go through 3 stages of looking at these institutions. First, you see them very distantly, and you see them according to the kind of mythology of the institution. And the mythology of the institution is that there's this incredible cornucopia, this incredible banquet of intellectual delights. Every form of truth is laid out, et cetera, et cetera. And you get closer to these things, and you start to smell them, and you're like, well, especially in certain areas, I'm really looking at a vast dung heap. And that's the attitude that I think many Trump supporters have. They have a very they're just like, there's nothing here, this needs to be scattered to the wind. I would say look closer at that dung heap, and you'll find always in every one of these elite institutions that I have come into contact with, there are real kernels of corn amidst the dung. Okay, and these are the seeds of basically the next generation that are, lead to renewal. There are people that really believe in these values. The values are eternal. Veritas is eternal, and so on and so forth. And when we see, and I believe that I agree with Professor Allen, I believe that there's a capacity for renewal here, but I also believe that it, takes looking very, very hard at what Harvard is and became during the 20th century, which is very different from what it was in any of the past centuries. And unfortunately, when we sort of put it up against, I've sort of discussed, ad nauseum the virtues of an ideal monarchy. And what we have in the Trump administration is very far from being a monarchy at all, because Trump, as he says, is really a rebel and not an emperor, and he's disrupting a system rather than creating a new system. But also, when we look at that, we see many of the failings of monarchy. And so when we, to come back to my updated Aristotelian trinity, where monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy become authority, prestige, and popularity, we see in the Trump administration, we see these classic tropes of authoritarian populism. And it's not wrong, even though Trump is not Hitler, it's not wrong to say that these are both authoritarian populist regimes, and that there's something brittle and something broken and something questionable and something wrong about authoritarian populism without a backbone of prestige, without a backbone of aristocracy, without institutions. And I would say, just as the sort of the challenge of these institutions is to renew themselves, the challenge of the enemies of these institutions is to explain where we go from here, and how that prestige is regenerated, and whether it's generated, by the kernels of corn, sprouting again into a new beautiful cornfield, whether it's represented by new institutions is unclear. But what is clear is that prestigious institutions are necessary and essential. Prestige is essential. Democracy, in my strict meaning of the word democracy, populism is not enough. Authority is not enough. Veritas is necessary. Institutions are necessary. Institutions that filter truth from error through our Darwinian process, which is, again, the ideal of science, which is a very, very valid ideal, are necessary. But when you see science being filtered for power or for empire building rather than for veritas, there are many, many examples of this in science that do not involve killing 20 million people, that just involve, wasting a lot of time. I guess I always use the amyloid hypothesis as my example of that. You basically see a really considerable amount of redirection that needs to take place and restructuring that needs to take place to serve these ideals. Whether that restructuring takes place as a result of an internal process of renewal or an external process of forced renewal is, I think, very, very unclear in the historical situation in which we exist. But I would, and I hope we can agree on this, institutions like the university that we're at are necessary and essential, and a lot of change is needed within them.
Thank you, Professor Allen.
Thank you. We can agree that universities like this are essential and have a distinguished history, and also have available to them a distinguished future, that they do also have within them already the energies and dynamism of renewal. The question really, I think, is about the broader context. What are those institutions contributing to? Are they contributing to the ongoing life of a free society for free and equal self-governing citizens, or for an alternative? One of the arguments in Mr. Yarvin's book is that Hitler and Stalin gave absolute monarchs a bad name. And in his argument, they gave absolute monarchs a bad name because, in his argument, they were driven to excess, the excesses of the Holocaust and the gulags, because of existential threats from the Anglo-American alliance. Now, this is not good history of the unfolding of the totalitarian impacts of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. So I say that to make the point that as we consider the future of institutions of civil society, we have to be equally clear-eyed and honest about what we can and should desire in our political institutions, absolute monarchy is not a path to the protection of freedom. In that regard, we need the same thing both in our political institutions and in our civil society institutions. We need renovation in our universities, we need renovation in our democracy. But in both cases, we should absolutely preserve the anchors for human freedom.
Well, thank you very much to both Professor Allen and Mr. Yarvin. I believe right after this, we'll have food and drinks just across the hall, if I have that right. We have it until 10 p.m. Thank you all very much for coming out, and see you all soon.